The terrifying night, when the door opened and nothing was left. Welcome to Ghastly Guide YouTube channel. Let me tell you about the night that changed everything. The night I learned that some doors should never be opened and some places should remain forgotten forever. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened in Millbrook Sanitarium. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear like the others, at least someone will understand why. It started 3 weeks ago when I received a letter that shouldn't have existed. The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed with black wax that bore no discernible mark. My name was written across the front in spidery handwriting that seemed to shift in the lamplight. Inside, the paper felt brittle beneath my fingers, as if it might crumble to dust at any moment. Dr. Sarah Chun, it began. Your expertise in psychiatric archaeology is required at the Millbrook Sanitarium. The building has been sealed since 1953, but recent structural assessments have revealed chambers that do not appear on any original blueprints. We need someone with your unique qualifications to document what lies within before the demolition begins next month. Compensation: $50,000 for 1 week's work. Please respond by midnight tomorrow if interested. The letter was signed by someone called H. Blackwood, representing the Millbrook Historical Preservation Society. What struck me as odd was that I'd never heard of Millbrook Sanitarium, despite having spent the last 15 years documenting abandoned psychiatric facilities across New England. A quick internet search revealed nothing. No records, no photographs, no mentions in historical documents. It was as if the place had been systematically erased from existence. But $50,000 for a week's work? In my line of work, that was impossible to ignore. I'd been struggling financially since the university cut my research funding, and this seemed like exactly the kind of discovery that could resurrect my career. So against my better judgment, I called the number provided. The voice that answered was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. Dr. Chun, how delightful that you decided to join us. The sanitarium is located approximately 2 hours north of Burlington. I'll text you the coordinates. GPS won't work in that area, I'm afraid. The locals are superstitious about the place. You'll need to arrive after sunset tomorrow. The building is quite unstable during daylight hours. Before I could ask what that meant, the line went dead. I spent the rest of that day researching everything I could about Millbrook. I found a few fragmentary references in old newspaper archives, mentions of a tragic fire in 1953, whispered rumors of experimental treatments, but nothing concrete. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that information about this place had been deliberately suppressed. The drive north took me through increasingly desolate countryside. Pine forests pressed close to the narrow road, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at sunset, the world beneath felt perpetually trapped in twilight. My phone lost signal about an hour into the journey, and the GPS flickered out completely as I turned onto a dirt road that wasn't marked on any map. That's when I saw it for the first time. Millbrook Sanitarium rose from a clearing like a monument to madness itself. The building was massive, 5 stories of blackened brick and broken windows, with twin towers that clawed at the darkening sky like desperate fingers. Gothic revival architecture twisted into something malevolent, with pointed arches that seemed to leer down at me and gargoyles whose stone faces appeared to shift in my peripheral vision. But it was a silence that truly unsettled me. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the trees. Just absolute, suffocating quiet that made my own breathing sound thunderous. As I parked near the main entrance, I noticed other cars in the makeshift lot. 3 vehicles covered in dust and pine needles, as if they'd been sitting there for weeks. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever team I was supposed to be joining had been here for quite some time. The front doors were massive oak things, at least 12 feet tall, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They were slightly ajar, and from within came a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to breathe like a living thing. I grabbed my equipment bag and approached, my footsteps echoing hollowly on the cracked stone steps. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. "This is Dr. Chun. I'm here about the documentation project." No response, but the glow from within seemed to pulse faster, more eagerly, as if the building itself was excited by my arrival. I pushed through the doors and stepped into the main lobby. The interior was a nightmare of decay and impossible architecture. The ceiling soared upward into shadows that seemed too deep for the building's actual height, supported by pillars carved with the same eye-watering symbols as the doors. Ancient wheelchairs had scattered about like the shells of dead insects, and patient files lay strewn across the floor, their pages fluttering despite the complete absence of any breeze. But it was a reception desk that made my blood freeze. A guest registry lay open upon it, and I could see fresh signatures, names written in that same spidery handwriting as my invitation. The dates went back weeks, but what terrified me was that I recognized two of the names: Dr. Marcus Webb, a colleague from Boston University, and Sarah Morrison, a forensic psychiatrist I'd worked with last year. Neither of them had been heard from in over a month. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I heard for the first time a sound that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It started as a low humming, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere deep within the building. But as I listened, it began to resolve into something that might have been voices, or might have been screaming, or might have been laughter. The sound was coming from upstairs. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run back to my car and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't shake the thought of my missing colleagues, and beneath my growing terror was a scholar's curiosity that demanded answers. Besides, I told myself, there had to be a rational explanation. Old buildings make strange noises. My imagination was running wild because of the unsettling atmosphere. I was lying to myself, of course, but sometimes we need those lies to function. I climbed the main staircase, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The banister felt wrong under my hand, not just old or weathered, but somehow organic, as if it were made of bone rather than wood. The walls were lined with patient photographs, dozens of them, but their faces seemed to follow my movement, and I could swear their expressions changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. The humming grew louder as I reached the second floor, and now I could hear distinct voices within it. Conversations, arguments, what sounded like medical consultations. I followed the sound down a corridor lined with patient rooms, their doors hanging open like mouse frozen in silent screams. Then I saw the light spilling from a room at the end of the hall. As I approached, I could hear familiar voices. Dr. Webb's distinctive baritone, Sarah Morrison's crisp Boston accent, and others I didn't recognize. They sounded different, though, flat, emotionless, as if they were reading from scripts. I peered around the doorframe and felt my sanity take its first real hit. The room was impossible. From the outside, it should have been just another patient chamber, maybe 20 feet by 15, but inside, it stretched into a vast circular amphitheater with tiers of stone, seating rising into shadows above. Ancient surgical equipment gleamed under lights that had no visible source, and in the center of it all was an operating table where something that might once have been human lay writhing under restraints. My colleagues sat in the front row, still wearing clothes they disappeared in, but their eyes were wrong, completely black, like pools of oil. They were watching the thing on the table with rapt attention, occasionally taking notes in journals that seemed to write themselves. "Ah, Dr. Chun," came a voice from behind me. Right on schedule. I spun around to find a tall, gaunt man in an old-fashioned medical coat. His face was pale as parchment, with features that seemed to shift slightly whenever I tried to focus on them. This had to be H. Blackwood, though he looked nothing like I'd imagined from his voice on the phone. "Where are my colleagues?" I demanded, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What's wrong with their eyes?" He smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "Nothing is wrong with them, Dr. Chun. They've simply been enlightened, as you will be once you completed your documentation work." What kind of work? This wasn't what was described in the letter, wasn't it? His head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You're here to document what lies within these walls, are you not? The truth about what happened here, what's still happening here, the experiments that never ended." Despite my terror, I found myself pulled into the conversation. This was what I'd spent my career searching for: the hidden histories, the covered-up atrocities. What kind of experiments? The kind that prove consciousness is far more malleable than anyone imagined. Dr. Millbrook was a visionary, you see. He understood that the human mind isn't a fixed thing, but rather a doorway. Open the right door in the right way, and you can step through into other places. As he spoke, the thing on the operating table let out a sound that might have been laughing or sobbing. My colleagues turned to look at me in perfect unison, their oil-black eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. The patients here weren't being treated, Blackwood continued. They were being prepared, hollowed out, you might say, to make room for new tenants. The fire in 1953 was an accident. It was the final phase of the experiment. 67 patients and staff members burned alive, but they didn't die. Death is just another door after all. I backed away from him, my rational mind finally catching up to what my instincts have been screaming all along. You're insane. This is some kind of elaborate hoax. Is it? He gestured to the impossible room behind me. Your instruments should be working by now. Dr. Chun, check your equipment. Document what you see. Isn't that what you came here to do? Against my better judgment, I glanced at the electromagnetic field detector on my belt. The readings were off the charts, fluctuating wildly between frequencies that shouldn't exist. My digital camera was taking pictures on its own, the flash firing repeatedly as it captured images of things I couldn't see. The building is saturated with residual psychic energy, Blackwood explained, watching my growing horror with obvious pleasure. 67 minds, trapped between life and death, slowly learning to manipulate the fabric of reality itself. They've had 70 years to practice. Dr. Chan, 70 years to grow hungry. The humming sound was getting louder, and now I could make out words in it. Names, addresses, personal details about my life that no one should have known. They were inside my head somehow, reading my thoughts, learning about me the same way they'd learned about my colleagues. The other cars in the parking lot. I whispered, "How many people have you brought here?" "Enough," Blackwood said. "We needed fresh minds, you see. The old patients are limited. They can manipulate reality within these walls, but they can't leave. They need new vessels, new doorways to walk through into the wider world. Each person who enters becomes another potential exit." I realized then that I'd been unbelievably naive. This wasn't a research opportunity. It was a trap, carefully baited with exactly the kind of mystery I couldn't resist. They'd studied me, learned my weaknesses, crafted the perfect lure. "My colleagues," I said, "are they still themselves?" Blackwood's smile widened impossibly. "In a sense, their memories, their personalities, their knowledge, it's all still there. But they're sharing the space now with something else. Something that's been waiting a very long time for a chance to experience the world beyond these walls." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If these things could inhabit human bodies, could pass for normal people, then they were already out there. How many missing persons cases were actually successful possessions? How many people walking around were really something else wearing a human face? Why me? I asked, why specifically target people in my field? "Because you understand the importance of documentation," Blackwood replied. "You believe in preserving history, in making sure important discoveries aren't lost. We need someone to record what happens next, to tell the world about our success. You're going to help us write the final chapter of the Millbrook experiment." That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, coming from the impossible amphitheater. My colleagues were standing now, moving toward the doorway with that same eerie synchronization. Their oil-black eyes never blinked, and their faces wore expressions of patient hunger. I ran. Running through Millbrook Sanitarium was like fleeing through a fever dream designed by a madman. The corridors shifted and changed behind me, walls stretching and contracting like the throats of vast beasts. Doors appeared where none had been moments before, while passages I just traversed simply vanished into solid stone. The building was alive, and it was hunting me. Behind me, I could hear them coming, not just my possessed colleagues, but others. Footsteps that squelched wetly against the floor, voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech, and that constant, maddening humming that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The electromagnetic detector on my belt was screaming with readings that defied every law of physics I knew. I ducked into what I hoped was a storage room, pressing my back against the door as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my equipment, but I forced myself to check the readings. The camera had taken over 300 pictures in the last 10 minutes, capturing images that showed things my eyes had refused to see, shadowy figures lurking in doorways, faces pressed against windows from the inside, and worst of all, myself from angles that should have been impossible, as if something was documenting my terror from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The room I'd chosen for shelter turned out to be some kind of medical storage area, filled with antique surgical equipment and glass, containers holding specimens that definitely weren't human. But it was the journals that caught my attention. Dozens of leather-bound volumes stacked on metal shelves, each one filled with the same spidery handwriting as my invitation. I pulled one down and opened it to a random page, using my phone's flashlight to read despite the way the light seemed to bend and twist unnaturally in this place. Day 847 of the Integration Protocol. Subject 23 has shown remarkable adaptation to the sharing process. The original personality maintains most day-to-day functions, while our resident has gained significant influence over deeper cognitive processes. Subject reports no distress, though this may be due to modified memory engrams. Note: Subject 23 has begun writing poetry in ancient Akkadian, despite having no prior knowledge of the language. I flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry documenting what they call successful integrations. The dates span decades, going back to the 1950s and continuing right up to the present day. Worse, there were photographs, before and after shots of the subjects. The before pictures showed normal people, but the after shots revealed individuals with those same oil-black eyes I'd seen in my colleagues. There were hundreds of them. A soft scratching at the door made me freeze. Then came Sarah Morrison's voice, but wrong somehow, as if she were speaking through water. "Dr. Chin? Sarah, we know you're in there. There's no need to be frightened. We just want to talk." I held my breath, hoping they'd move on, but then Dr. Webb spoke up from what sounded like right next to my ear, despite the fact that I was alone in the room. "The integration process isn't painful, Sarah. In fact, most subjects report a sense of profound peace once the sharing begins. You'll retain all of your memories, all of your knowledge. You'll still be you, just more. How are you doing this?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. "The boundary between thought and reality becomes quite fluid here," came Blackwood's voice from everywhere and nowhere. 70 years of focused psychic energy tends to have that effect. We can hear your thoughts, feel your fear, taste your memories. You've already begun to change, Dr. Chun. The process started the moment you walked through our doors. I looked down at my hands and nearly screamed. The skin was becoming translucent, and underneath I could see something that looked like dark water flowing through my veins instead of blood. My reflection in a nearby glass specimen jar showed eyes that were starting to darken around the edges. "No," I breathed. "No, this isn't possible. This is hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, something." "Is it?" Blackwood's voice was amused. "Check your equipment, Doctor. What do your instruments tell you?" The readings were impossible. EM fields that shifted between dimensions, temperature fluctuations that ranged from absolute zero to several thousand degrees, and radiation signatures that didn't correspond to any known elements. Either every piece of scientific equipment I carried had simultaneously malfunctioned in precisely the same way, or I was witnessing something that existed entirely outside conventional physics. The scratching at the door intensified, and now I could hear multiple voices whispering in unison. "Let us in, Sarah. Let us help you. The sharing is beautiful. You'll understand once you stop fighting it." I grabbed as many journals as I could carry and looked around desperately for another exit. The room had no windows, but there was a ventilation grate near the ceiling that looked just large enough for a person to crawl through. Using a surgical table as a stepping stool, I managed to pry the grate open and hauled myself into the ductwork. The ventilation system was a maze of metal tunnels that seemed to extend far beyond the building's actual dimensions. I crawled through them on my hands and knees, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and my pursuers. The journals I'd stolen made rustling sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in a confined space, but I wasn't about to leave them behind. They were evidence of what was happening here, proof that someone needed a document. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I emerged from a grate on the 4th floor in what appeared to be the former administration wing. The area was less overtly hostile than the lower floors, though the walls still seemed to pulse with that subtle organic rhythm that suggested the building's unnatural life. I found an office that still had most of its furniture intact and barricaded myself inside, pushing a heavy desk against the door. Then I sat down and began reading through the journal systematically, looking for some clue about how to escape or fight back against whatever these things were. What I found was far worse than I'd imagined. The Millbrook experiment hadn't been an isolated incident. Dr. Millbrook had been part of a network of researchers conducting similar work at facilities across the country, all of them funded by shadowy government agencies and private organizations. The goal was to create a new form of human being, one that could serve as a bridge between our reality and what they called the deeper territories. The fire in 1953 hadn't been the end of the experiment. It had been the beginning of Phase 2. According to the journals, the burning building had become a focal point for something they termed dimensional convergence. The dying minds of the patients and staff had somehow punched a hole through to somewhere else, and things have been crawling through ever since. Not invading exactly, but merging, learning to wear human consciousness like clothing. The possessed individuals weren't being controlled. They were being partnered with. The original personality remained largely intact, but it was sharing headspace with something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. Most of the subjects never even realized what had happened to them. They went back to their lives, carrying passengers that influenced their decisions, shaped their desires, and slowly began preparing the world for a much larger convergence. One journal entry, dated just 2 months ago, made my blood run cold. Phase 3 preparations are now complete. We have successfully placed integrated subjects in key positions throughout government, academia, and media. The final convergence event is scheduled for the winter solstice. All that remains is to gather enough fresh minds to serve as anchors for crossing. The old patients have grown restless. They're eager to finally walk in the world beyond these walls. The winter solstice was less than a month away. I was still processing the implications when I heard something that made my heart stop. My own voice coming from the hallway outside, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? This is Dr. Sarah Chun, and I think I might be lost." They'd learned to mimic me perfectly, which meant they had access not just to my thoughts, but to my vocal patterns, my mannerisms, my memories. How long before they could replace me entirely? The thing wearing my voice knocked politely on the door. "Excuse me, I can hear someone moving around in there. I'm a researcher working on a documentation project, and I seem to have gotten separated from my team. Could you help me?" It sounded exactly like me. If I hadn't known better, I would have opened that door without hesitation. Instead, I quietly began looking for another way out, because I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about my survival anymore. If these things could perfectly impersonate anyone they'd studied, then no one was safe. They could be anywhere, anyone, wearing the faces of our friends and family while they prepared the world for invasion. And I was running out of time to stop them. I spent the next several hours in that barricaded office, reading through every journal I could find while the thing wearing my voice paced the hallways outside. What I discovered in those pages wasn't just a history of a failed medical experiment. It was a blueprint for the systematic colonization of human consciousness on a global scale. Dr. Millbrook had been brilliant, but he'd also been completely insane. His early work in the 1940s had focused on what he called consciousness archaeology, the idea that human minds retain traces of ancient, pre-human awareness buried deep in our evolutionary memory. His initial experiments had involved using extreme psychological trauma to strip away the surface personality and expose these deeper layers. But somewhere in the process, he discovered that the boundaries between individual minds weren't as solid as everyone believed. Under the right conditions, consciousness could be shared, transferred, even completely overwritten. And if human minds were naturally flexible, then what about non-human intelligence? What if those deep, Ancient traces weren't memories at all, but dormant passengers. The breakthrough had come in 1952 when Millbrook successfully opened what he called the interior door, a gateway not to another place, but to another state of being entirely. The entities that came through weren't invaders in any traditional sense. They were something far more insidious. Perfect parasites that enhanced their hosts rather than destroying them. Each integration made the host more capable, more intelligent, more charismatic. They retained their original personality completely, but gained access to knowledge and abilities that span millennia. From a host perspective, it felt like awakening from a lifelong dream. They genuinely believed the partnership was beneficial, because in many ways it was. The horror lay in what came next. Once integrated, the host began unconsciously preparing the world for a larger convergence event. They rose to positions of power and influence, not through any conscious conspiracy, but because their otherworldly partners made them remarkably effective at achieving their goals. They bred selectively, though they probably didn't realize it, creating offspring who were naturally more compatible with integration. They shaped culture and technology in subtle ways that would make the final convergence easier, and they recruited others just as I had been recruited. The letters, the mysterious job offers, the irresistible opportunities. They were all part of an elaborate selection process. The entities didn't want just anyone as a host. They wanted specific types of minds: researchers, academics, journalists, politicians, artists, people with the knowledge and influence to shape society from within. I was still absorbing the full implications when I heard new voices in the hallway. Not my possessed colleagues this time, but fresh victims. A man was arguing with someone, insisting that he'd received a legitimate job offer from the Historical Preservation Society. A woman was asking about her missing graduate advisor, who'd supposedly been conducting research here. They were bringing in a new batch. I had to get out, not just for my own sake, but because I was probably the only person who understood what was really happening. The journals made it clear that the integration process could be resisted, but only if the subject knew what to expect and fought against it from the beginning. Once someone accepted the partnership, even unconsciously, it became irreversible. But first, I needed to find the source. Every facility in the network had what the journals referred to as a focal point, the original breach where the entities had first crossed over. If I could find Millbrook's focal point and somehow disrupt it, I might be able to prevent the final convergence. According to the building plans I'd found, there was a sub-basement that didn't appear on any of the official blueprints. The fire damage reports from 1953 mentioned that the basement levels had been completely sealed off, supposedly because of structural instability. But I was beginning to suspect the real reason was to contain whatever was down there. I gathered up the most important journals and prepared to leave my makeshift shelter. The thing that sounded like me had moved on, probably a hunt for new arrivals, and the hallway outside seemed temporarily clear. I had maybe minutes before they realized I was mobile again. The stairway to the sub-basement was hidden behind what looked like a maintenance closet on the ground floor. The door was locked, but the metal had been weakened by decades of supernatural influence, and I was able to force it open with a crowbar I'd found in the office. The stairs descended far deeper than should have been possible, the walls changing from institutional brick to rough-hewn stone as I went lower. The air grew thick and warm, carrying scents that had no earthly origin, something like ozone mixed with copper and flowers left too long in stagnant water. At the bottom, I found myself in a natural cave system that extended far beyond the building's foundation. Phosphorescent moss provided a sickly green illumination, revealing chambers carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was a sound that truly terrified me, that familiar humming, but infinitely louder and more complex, as if I were listening to a choir of 10,000 voices singing in perfect harmony. I followed the sound deeper into caves until I reached a circular chamber dominated by a massive stone door. It was easily 20 feet tall and covered in the same eye-watering symbols I'd seen throughout the building, but these ones seemed to move and shift like living things. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap poured a light that wasn't quite any color I could name. This was it, the interior door, the original breach. As I approached, I could see that the symbols weren't carved into the stone at all. They were growing from it, like some kind of crystalline infection that was slowly transforming the rock into something else entirely. The light from beyond the door was getting brighter, and I could hear new sounds, wind that carried voices, music that wasn't quite music, and underneath it all, the sound of something vast breathing. I understood then why the final convergence was scheduled for the winter solstice. The door was opening wider, slowly but steadily. In less than a month, it would be completely open, and whatever was on the other side would be able to cross over en masse. But there was something else, too. The journals had mentioned that each facility in the network was connected to the others through what they called resonance pathways. If I could disrupt the focal point here, it might create a cascade effect that would close all the doors simultaneously. The problem was that I had no idea how to actually do it. The journals were full of theoretical discussions about consciousness transference and dimensional barriers, but they were frustratingly vague about the practical mechanics of the process. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Blackwood emerging from one of the side passages, no longer bothering to maintain his human appearance. His form shifted and flowed like smoke-given substance, and his eyes were windows into a darkness so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. "Dr. Chun," he said, his voice now a harmony of tones that spoke directly to my bones. "We've been waiting for you to find this place. Did you really think you could wander our halls unsupervised without us allowing it? You wanted me to find the door," I said, the pieces finally clicking together. This was all part of the recruitment process. Of course, we needed someone with your specific combination of knowledge and skepticism, someone who would document the truth, understand its implications, and ultimately choose to join us willingly rather than be forced into integration. "Choose to join you?" I laughed, a sound that was equal parts hysteria and defiance. "After everything I've seen, you think I would voluntarily let one of those things into my head?" "Those things." Blackwood's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "Dr. Chun, you're looking at this entirely backwards. We're not the invaders here. We're the original inhabitants, and humanity is finally advanced enough to serve as proper partners." He gestured to the door behind me, and I could see shapes moving in the light beyond, tall, graceful forms that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. "Your species has been alone in the universe for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly connected to something greater. We're offering you a chance to evolve, to become part of something magnificent and eternal. The integration isn't colonization, it's collaboration. And if I refuse, then you'll die here, and we'll find someone else to document the final phase. But I don't think you will refuse, Dr. Chun. You're a researcher. This is a discovery of a lifetime, the first confirmed contact with non-human intelligence, the key to understanding the true nature of consciousness itself. Could you really walk away from that?" He was right, and I hated him for it. Even knowing the truth, even understanding the full horror of what they were planning, part of me was desperately curious about what lay beyond that door. The academic in me was screaming that this was the greatest discovery in human history, and I was the only one positioned to document it properly. But I thought about the possessed individuals I'd seen, with their oil-black eyes and perfect synchronization. I thought about the network of integrated subjects spreading across the world, unconsciously preparing for invasion. I thought about what humanity would become once the final convergence was complete. "No," I said quietly. "Some doors should stay closed." I pulled the thermite charges from my equipment bag, standard demolition tools that I carry for breaking through obstacles in abandoned buildings. I've been carrying enough explosive to clear block passages, but it might be just enough to collapse this chamber and bury the focal point permanently. Blackwood's form solidified into something more recognizably human as he realized what I was planning. "Dr. Chun, please think about what you're doing. You'll be destroying the greatest opportunity in human history, the chance for your species to transcend its limitations, to become part of something greater than yourselves." "Maybe," I said, setting the charges around the base of the stone door. "But I'd rather humanity remain human than become something else, even if that something else is supposedly better." I activated the timer and ran. The explosion shook the entire building, and I could hear screams from multiple levels as the supernatural architecture began to collapse. The phosphorescent moss died instantly, plunging the caves into absolute darkness, but I had my flashlight and the memory of the path I'd taken to reach this place. By the time I made it back to the surface, Millbrook Sanitarium was tearing itself apart. The impossible rooms were folding in on themselves. The organic walls were withering and cracking, and the air itself seemed to be unraveling. I could see figures running through the halls. Some of them the possessed individuals I'd encountered earlier, but others were clearly the new recruits who'd arrived that night. I tried to help them escape, shouting warnings and directions, but most of them couldn't hear me over the building's death throes. In the end, I managed to save 3 people: a historian from Yale, a documentary filmmaker, and a graduate student who'd been looking for her missing advisor. We made it to the parking lot just as the building completed its collapse, folding it on itself in ways that defied geometry until nothing remained but a pile of rubble and a crater that seemed to extend deeper than should have been possible. That was 3 weeks ago. The official report blamed the collapse on structural instability caused by decades of neglect, and there was no mention of the Historical Preservation Society or the missing researchers. The 3 people I'd saved remember entering the building, but nothing after that. Their memories of what happened inside had been completely wiped. But I remember everything, and I've been documenting it all ever since. Because even though I disrupted the focal point at Millbrook, the journals made it clear that there were other facilities in the network, other doors, other recruitment operations. The integration process is still active, and the final convergence is still scheduled for the winter solstice. I've been traveling from city to city, trying to track down the other facilities, but it's like chasing shadows. Every lead goes cold. Every trail ends in deliberately destroyed records. The network is vast and well-established, and they've had 70 years to perfect their methods. Worse, I can't be sure who I can trust. Anyone could be integrated. Anyone could be a partner rather than a person. How do you fight an invasion when the invaders were the faces of your friends? But I have to try, because the alternative is unthinkable. In 18 days, something is going to happen that will change humanity forever, and I'm probably the only person who knows it's coming. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. Don't trust anyone who offers you mysterious job opportunities or research grants. Don't investigate abandoned psychiatric facilities, especially ones that don't appear in official records. And if you ever find yourself in front of a door covered in symbols that hurt to look at, run. Some doors should never be opened. And if they do open, make sure nothing is left. __________________________________________________________________________________________________